Thank you very much. I know you've been sitting a long time, so I will try my darndest to keep you awake. First, I want to thank the Schenker Institute and the American Prospect and the Sidney Hillman Foundation and Leo in particular for arranging this impressive array of speakers on this very important topic. I reminded Leo that when I was at NYU Law School back in 1982, I organized a conference that was called The Labor Movement at the Crossroads. How does that saying go? History repeats itself. I was incredibly flattered by what Labor Secretary Perez said about me. And I just want to say there are other terrific labor reporters, some of them in this room, Harold Meyerson, David Moberg, Dave Jamieson, Lydia DePillis, Josh Idelson. You know, there's a very good sorority fraternity of labor reporters, and long may they thrive. And I hope there will soon be another one at the New York Times. I must confess, I felt very torn retiring from the New York Times. I loved my job, I loved my beat, but I'd been working my fanny off for 31 years, and I'm 63, and I said it was time. And I often told myself, my father, who was continued teaching community college as a low-paid adjunct, as an adjunct till the age of 82, would have said, Steve, you're just a kid. How could you leave the New York Times at the age of 63? And my mother would have said, Stephen, you're working too hard. You should retire. You're going to have a heart attack. So anyway, so I hope to continue writing about labor. I'm going to write another book. I just want to say something that some of you have already heard, that when my father left the Army in 1945, the first job he took was with Sidney Hillman at the AFL-CIO, when Hillman was heading the Committee on Political Education, basically the political action department of organized labor of the AFL-CIO. So now to my formal remarks. I just want to make clear, I'm not here as an advocate, I'm here as an observer discussing what I've seen in my years writing about labor. One observation, as many of you know, as I wrote about at length in my book, is that things are very broken for the American worker. You know, the rise of part-time labor, contingent labor, misclassification, wage theft. I could talk about that for 2 hours, but I think many of you understand all that. Another observation, the American political system and its campaign finance system are also fundamentally broken. And I believe that American workers will not get a fair deal so long as, from the political system, as long as the campaign finance system allows virtually unlimited spending by the ultra-rich. In my view, workers will get a fair shake only when there is public financing of national and state campaigns. And I think this is an important thing for people who believe in fairness, for the labor movement to sincerely think about. I often imagine that if members of Congress had to rely on public financing rather than on tap dancing in front of for their wealthy donors, a higher minimum wage would have breezed through Congress long ago. And I realize it might take a constitutional amendment to bring about real public financing, and I also realize that there are forces in society that will fight very hard against that. I began covering labor in late 1995, just as John Sweeney was elected president of the AFL-CIO and someone named Richard Trumka was elected vice president. And the Sweeney-Trumka leadership did a lot of things that one would think needed to be done to reverse organized labor's decline. They did larger organizing campaigns, they built up training, they spent more money on organizing, they got young people much more involved in labor through Union Summer, they got clergy and academics involved, they made labor an ally rather than an enemy of immigrants. They used social media more effectively. They improved their website. But despite all these smart efforts, union density continued to sink. Yes, there were some big victories. 74,000 home care workers organized in LA in 1999. The many thousands of airline workers, tens of thousands who voted to unionize. The Teamsters have had great success, unheralded success in organizing more than 10,000 bus drivers with First Student, and the AFT organized 28,000 child care workers in New York. I mean, these are major, major successes. They took a lot of perspiration, inspiration, intelligence. But despite such victories, net, the union movement, the labor movement has been shrinking. Many have dissected why this is happening. I agree that the foremost reason why labor is declining is that employer resistance has gotten so sophisticated and at times aggressive. Employers really know how to beat back unionization drives. But that's not the only reason. Some unions have largely given up on organizing. Some unions no longer have the expertise to mount a smart, large organizing drive, even if they wanted to. With unions no longer in the news much, no longer at the center of things as they were back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of workers know precious little about unions, and some have bought into the notion, pushed by folks on the right, that unions are there just to take your dues and don't do much for you. It's also true that many workers who are unhappy with their wages and working conditions are too scared to stick their necks out to support a union. They worry they'll get fired or demoted. And in ways, the legal structure is tilted against unions and union organizing. For instance, employers have access to workers 24/7 for one-on-one meetings, to show videos, while union organizers are prohibited from setting foot on company property. That's a long list of reasons why labor organizers face such a problem, why unions are shrinking, and I don't think there are any easy answers to reverse any of these factors contributing to organized labor's decline, and any easy answer to reversing the overall problem. In my book, The Big Squeeze, I wrote about the SEIU's victory in organizing 5,200 janitors in Houston. I wrote about that because it was such a signal success in unionizing an unlikely group. The janitors all work for some subcontractors. They all work part-time. Almost all of them were undocumented. Very few of them spoke English. But as a result of this organizing victory and the subsequent contract, these janitors' work weeks went from 20 hours a week to 30 hours a week. Their hourly pay rose 60%, and that meant that their wages doubled within 3 years, plus they got health coverage for the first time. And I wrote about that example because it shows how a successful unionization drive can lift the lives of thousands of families. In recent weeks, I've been asking some friends, for other examples of recent unionization campaigns that have translated into similar significant improvements in wages and benefits. And I really haven't heard of any such examples. But, my ears are open for other examples. I realize in the recent contract won by service workers at the Los Angeles School District, 20,000 custodians, special ed assistants, and safety monitors, cafeteria workers are seeing their wages go from $8, $9, $10 an hour to $15 an hour by 2016. That's a significant victory. I think that stems in part from the election of a pro-labor mayor in Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, that mayor who was opposed by organized labor in the primaries. 2 years ago in January, the BLS reported that union density had dropped to 11.3% from 11.8%. That's a very major drop in 1 year. And that overall union membership had fallen by 400,000, even though the overall workforce had grown by 2.5 million in the preceding year. The next day, my editor, the business editor of the New York Times, called me in for a meeting and said, "Steve, I think it would be smart to do a series of articles about what's going to happen to workers' voice. Who's going to speak up for workers when traditional unions are declining? Some would say even shriveling." So out of that request, I profiled some organizations whose leaders just spoke: the Freelancers Union, the Workers' Defense Project, and I also wrote about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I wrote about the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy. I've written about many other worker centers: Make the Road, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the Retail Action Project, Domestic Workers United. I've written about Rich Trumka and how organized labor is allying itself more than ever with worker centers and immigrant groups, African American groups, environmental groups to push forward with a progressive agenda, partly because labor has recognized that it is no longer as strong as it once was and can't achieve things by itself the way it used to. Sarah Horowitz and Christina Chinchun just talked a few minutes ago about their organization successes, and I was always impressed that Itsy Bitsy Workers' Defense Project was able to win such an impressive victory against Apple. I'm not going to call Apple a Goliath. It's too smart to be considered a Goliath, but hats off on that victory. One of the great stories about the Workers' Defense Project is, when they were a small group with like 5, 6 staff members, they were alarmed about the number of construction worker deaths in Texas in 1 year. It's about 130. So they built, black wooden coffins for like 130 workers, and then this little group got hundreds of, construction workers involved in building these coffins, and they marched through the streets of Austin carrying these 130 or so coffins. And, and that was just brilliant. I'll use the word marketing or strategizing, that this little group with a small budget used its brains and creativity to get humongous amounts of attention to this cause of worker deaths. It was on TVs, it was on front pages. And I think that's a good example of showing how smart, creative organizers could really do a lot even when they don't have much money. So of the many non-union worker advocacy groups I've looked at, two, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and LANE, the Los Angeles Alliance of a New Economy, have, as far as I can tell, achieved the most in terms of numbers of workers helped. And I'll be the first to say that these worker centers, these alt-labor groups, a phrase Josh Eidelson developed, will probably never achieve as much as labor unions will in their prime. But at a time when unions are in decline and unions are having such a hard time organizing, and many workers are desperate for some voice and some way to improve their methods, their wages and working conditions, they're turning increasingly to worker centers, and the labor movement is very smartly helping underwrite many worker centers. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has lifted 30,000 tomato workers in Florida, again, many of them undocumented. And it's increased their wages by about 30%, and it has introduced a system that has gone far to curb sexual harassment and ensure rest breaks and working in the 95-degree heat in the tomato fields of Florida. And so how did this group, again, a small group, Greg Asbed, Laura Germino went down there in the 1990s. They founded this group. They work with Haitian immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, and they've built this into this real powerhouse in Florida. And so how did they achieve this? They took on Yum Brands, Taco Bell, and they did protest marches, they did hunger strikes, they did sit-ins, they got arrested, they did 200-mile marches, they got, of all the worker centers in the country, they're the ones that have really lined up student groups around the country backing them. And then when they have a protest against Taco Bell's or McDonald's, student groups around the country are rallying behind them and joining their boycotts. So again, I use this as an example of how very smart, very creative, very determined worker center, working closely with the community, can really do a tremendous amount to lift workers. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers really said, instead of focusing on the growers who only have a limited amount of money, they're paid a certain amount, they said, hey, we have to focus on the folks with the deep pockets, the Taco Bells, the McDonald's, and they've done very successful pressure campaigns, and they've gotten a lot of these groups to say uncle, cry uncle. Is it sexist to say cry uncle? Cry auntie, okay. The second group is the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, and we heard Elizabeth Bunn and others mention some of their success with the Jobs to Move America campaign, but I would suggest that that's the least of their successes. I mean, this group was founded 20 years ago, and working closely with Unite Here and the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, and Harold Meyerson has written wonderful stuff about them. LANE got the City Council of Los Angeles to approve a $15.37 base wage for thousands of hotel workers in Los Angeles. And thanks in part to LANE strategizing, LA seems well on its way to enacting a $13 citywide minimum wage. And remember, LA isn't as liberal as Seattle or as San Francisco, and the cost of living in LA isn't nearly as high as San Francisco or Seattle, so $13 ain't bad. LANE has accomplished much else. It pushed through one of the nation's first living wages, and that was, Baltimore's first, Los Angeles was second, and it's the Los Angeles one that really got the living wage movement rolling around the nation. LANE has assured far more minority hiring in city agencies and in city-backed construction projects. It has spearheaded a very impressive overhaul of the city's waste hauling industry that's going to greatly reduce pollution and improve conditions for some of the recycling workers that Teferi was talking about earlier. LANE owes its success most of all to the vision and creativity of three people, Maria Elena Durazo, Miguel Contreras, and Madeline Janis. They saw that labor had to build community alliances to succeed and had to help elect worker-friendly politicians. Lane's successes were, of course, helped by the fact that hundreds of thousands of Latino immigrants moved to LA, helping increase labor's power. In my view, one of the key tests for worker advocates today is whether they can build on what Lane has done and achieve similar successes in other cities. When David Rolfe gave his terrific talk earlier, I think David was in ways too modest. Because in Seattle, it wasn't just the Fight for 15 fast food workers that got the city of Los Angeles and got the mayor to back $15 minimum wage in the city. It was that Seattle has a real kick-ass progressive community. It's David's home care workers local, the UFCW local in Seattle is it has its act together, is very aggressive. The Teamsters in Seattle are unusual for Teamster locals. Then they work with clergy is very powerful, immigrant groups, and they work very closely with gay groups, have been very, very, very important in backing some of their efforts. So it's that soil, that fertile soil, that when the Fight for 15 really kicked in Seattle, that got the city council, that got the mayoral candidates saying, $15 is a good idea, and they were the first big city in the country to enact that. So lastly, in many ways, the most promising thing going on right now in organized labor is the Fight for 15 movement. And when I first wrote about it 2 years ago, and there were strikes at like 20, 30 restaurants in New York City involving 200 workers, I thought, that's an interesting little phenomenon, and I thought it would, go away. And now we've seen it in 150 cities, tens of thousands of workers, and I remember what Karen Nussbaum said to me in an interview about a year ago. Karen said, you can't solve the problems of the labor movement or the progressive movement until you restore the belief in collective action, collective power. And I think what we're seeing with the Fight for 15 movement, with the Our Walmart protests on Black Friday, with the Ferguson protests, with the Eric Garner protests, is there's some incipience even to, there's some, people are so upset and so angry that they're acting collectively. I'm not saying this is collectivism. I'm not going there. But the question is, as some people said, is, these are important steps if labor is going to rise again, if labor is going to help workers again, but can these really be translated into movements? And the SEIU has put a lot of money and a lot of organizers behind the Fight for 15 movement, but now a big question is, can they deliver on getting $15 for the workers? And if they can, that's a humongous success. If they can't, we're going to have to figure out, labor's going to have to figure out what all that means. I just want to end with, I was having a drink last night with some labor leader who said, we're at a moment in American history where the labor movement is weaker than ever before, certainly the weakest it's been since the Great Depression, but never before has, considering the condition of American workers right now and wage stagnation, there's never been a time when we need the labor movement more. So I think, there are a lot of questions facing traditional organized labor, facing worker centers, because when you look at the results of the elections last November, you look at what's happening with wages, you look at increased inequality, there's a lot of frustration out there among workers. And I don't think we need to use terms like class. There's just a lot of anger and alienation and upset, and people want a fairer deal. I think Mr. Truman, used to use a good phrase once upon a time. People think things are unfair, and the question is, how can that anger, upset, dismay be converted into an effort to create a fairer America with less inequality? So I will stop there. Okay.
So I don't think anybody's written any questions on cards. Let me do this. We have bag lunches for you out there. The object is you can just pick them up. You can come in here. You can sit down. We're going to give you half an hour both to eat and to chat with people you want to chat with. But in my capacity as presiding union thug, we will reconvene exactly in 30 minutes and restart with the rest of the program.